I'm going to get right into the subject matter. So Agile and Agile Scrum, everything you've wanted to know about Agile. So as Paul had mentioned, I've been doing this for quite some time in the field of enterprise IT best practices. So whether it be DevOps, whether it be Agile Scrum, whether it be ITIL, COBIT, any of those best practices out there today. This is where my expertise has been and experience with clients. And it's always fascinating because there's never any one perfect way to approach and adapt and adopt going forward. It all depends on the organization. It all depends on the client, the climate that they're in, and yeah, let's talk about making this practical as we go through. So I look forward to sharing some experience with you. And in essence, what we're going to cover today is the origins of Agile, Agile Scrum basics. We're going to talk about real practical things like how the approach of Scrum works, what are the artifacts, what are the techniques, what are the roles, and then we'll talk about how to transition to Scrum, because as you'll see, it's a very, very simple approach. However, it's very complex in its depth and adaptation. And it's meant to be. It's meant to be continually improved. So let's take a look at the origins of Scrum. So one of my little pet peeves out there today is a lot of organizations say, oh yeah, we need to be agile, right? And so that means in some people's minds, well, we're just going to do everything kind of Wild West, and you know, we're not going to document anything, and we're not going to follow any process, and we're not going to do this or do that. And it's all about speed, velocity, and I think that really does a disservice to the best practice. There are two, when you talk about being agile with the little a, that is the trait of a team, individual, or organization that lives and breathes these principles of agility that we'll take a look at. And that is based on this concept of the big A, which is Agile, the iterative approach that's detailed in the Agile Manifesto. And we will see that coming on the next slide. So just saying you're agile does not make you agile. There is discipline approach behind the concept of agility, and we will see this with Agile itself. So succeeding with Agile is not about having a single successful project, but it's how agility can transform an organization, and this really is near and dear in my heart. I have seen how effective the adoption of Agile is to an organization. Okay. We'll go to the next slide then. So everything about Agile is based on the Agile Manifesto, and you can view the manifesto at agilemanifesto.org. And it's here where we see the basics, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. So let's get a product out there. Let's not spend forever documenting requirements or in documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So it truly is getting that rapid feedback from the customer, engaging with the customer and the representative of the customer in a Scrum perspective. Responding to change over following to a plan. So whatever we do, it needs to be iterative. It needs to be adaptable. So it's recognized that there is value in the items on the right of that list, the small letters there, but the items on the left are valued more. And that is, in essence, the core of Agile. That's what drives everything that we do, is this manifesto and these core principles. So when you take those to heart, how is that different from today? So in today's world, where software development lifecycle came from was what's referred to as the Waterfall Method. That's where you spend time getting requirements up front for your system, your software requirements. You do a lot of work from a business analysis perspective. You come up with your design. You do your coding, you do your testing, you go into user acceptance testing, and then you go live. And that waterfall method, what had happened is that by the time you get to live product, a lot of times the business requirements were changed from the beginning. And I think a lot of people probably on this call have lived through that. One of the most challenging things is to get requirements from clients. Sometimes they just don't know. So this method, I don't want to say it's old, because it still exists, and there are still projects that do need to follow a waterfall approach. They definitely are in place and they do exist. However, over time, what we found is that for some design and to meet the demands of today's business needs and this increased speed and velocity and needing to do 100 deploys a night or 1,000 deploys a night in some of the big platforms, that this approach, this waterfall method of software development lifecycle did not work, nor was it delivering the results, because by the time we got to live environment, the requirements had changed. This often is in longer term projects, 6 months to a year, sometimes even longer. Okay? So to coincide with that, people moved into the world of Agile and software development. So what is Agile? So as we saw based on the Agile Manifesto, this is focus on people, working software, flexibility, having the customer involved, multidisciplinary teams, having a high trust environment. These are all words that you're hearing it. You want it to be iterative so that we're constantly getting feedback from the client. Incremental, so we can release in small chunks. This almost sounds a little bit like DevOps. Well, DevOps is based on this principle of Agile as well. It's very much integrated with this platform and core concepts of Agile. And one of the items that we'll talk about is that all of the activities that are prescribed within Scrum are time-boxed. So there is some element of framework that we work within. However, it is not, it's very, very simple, and it is not prescribed, that it's not overwhelming. It's not overwhelming to go into, is what I want to share. I just saw a message here, a chat. How can you tell if an IT project is better suited for waterfall versus Agile? That's a very good question. A lot of times it's based on the type of contract you have. So is it a fixed dollar amount contract where it's a very, very clear deliverable that you're driving towards, where it's very certain what you're going to deliver, that there is absolutely no opportunity for change within there, or very, very minimal amount of change. And it's typically driven through your regular project management perspective. Whereas within Agile, it tends to be a little looser. You do not perhaps know exactly the outcome that's desired. However, you are able to incrementally deliver value. So a lot of, we'll talk a bit more about feature delivered, feature development, etc. So it fits more into that mode. So there's no real cut and no fine measure of which ones fit each one, a waterfall approach versus an Agile approach. However, those are some of the guidelines you can go with there. Okay. So if we move into the next, there are many Agile frameworks out there that you may have experienced. So you've got XP, or extreme programming, and that's where you do the pair programming together. So you're checking code, you're sharing the code work, and it really is a iterative feedback approach. Crystal clear, not so common, but it is Agile for smaller teams. There's also SAFe, so Scaled Agile Framework for enterprises. So that's the big high-end adoption of Agile. and how you would approach that from an enterprise perspective. There are other agile methods that are popular. So DSDM, which is Dynamic Systems Development Model, and that's based on what's called Moscow. So that's where you are developing based on must have, should have, could have, and won't have. So that's Moscow. That's the MOSCW. FDD is your feature-driven development. So that's where you're planning your development by feature. So you can start to see how this kind of development fits a little bit more into that agile stream, as opposed to the, or is more agile in nature as opposed to the waterfall. And the final is Agile Unified Process, and that's a lot of test-driven development that's included within there as well. And the most popular application of Agile in a framework perspective is Scrum. And that's what we're going to focus the rest of the call on, is Scrum. Okay, but all of these they're based on the concept of Agile. So they're based on these methodologies. So what is Scrum? It's a very simple framework that people use to address where you've got a complex problem. So perhaps even, as I said, in your waterfall approach, you know exactly what you need to deliver. There's no question about the outcome. Here is, well, we're going to work through it, and we're going to come up with very creative solutions to be able to deliver the requirements that are needed by the business. So that is more that agile approach. And these products that we are actually going to deliver are going to be of the highest possible value. So it's always that iterative cycle back to the client, validating and adapting as we go through different iterations of the Scrum cycle. It is a very lightweight framework, so there are really 4 key events that we'll talk about. There's 3 key artifacts, and there's 3 main roles. It's very, very simple in its nature. It's not intended to be, you know, formally highly documented process. It's not explicit to me, although there are techniques that we can apply to be when we're practicing Agile and Agile Scrum to make us more successful. And there is a note on the bottom of some of these slides. It is based on the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide, if you go to scrumguides.org, you will be able to download for free a copy of the Scrum Guide. It is the basis for Scrum that every organization works from. And again, it's very lightweight, it's very simple. Okay, so Scrum itself is based on 3 key pillars. First pillar is transparency. So we need to have visibility of everything that we're doing, visibility of the outcomes. So defined by a common standard, so observers have a common understanding. So there is an element of awareness and education where when we talk about when we're doing Scrum, everybody realizes what a review meeting is, what a daily stand-up is, what an iteration is. So we've got that common language. And from a transparency perspective, very, very relevant that we use collaboration tools. One of the main tools that I've used here is Trello. I'm not sure if anybody's used that, but really great for visible, what's called a Kanban board, where you've got a visibility for to do, doing, and done, and any work in progress through there. So open transparency at all points throughout the Scrum cycle. Inspection. So you need to frequently inspect your artifacts, understand where you are now, know where your desired outcome is, and be able to adapt as you move through that cycle to make adjustments as early as possible. So it's almost the principle from a DevOps perspective is based on fail fast, fail often, fail quickly, and correct. And so this concept of an inspection, frequently inspect, is built into the Scrum approach as well. And also to adapt. So you can adapt on a daily basis when you inspect daily, and you can adapt each iteration or cycle of sprint that you go through. So really, these are the 3 core pillars of Scrum. And always to have kept in mind as you work through applying Scrum in your organization. The values then. There are specific values stated in Scrum, and these are values associated to the people participating in Scrum. So things like commitment. So the Scrum team is personally committing to achieve the goals that they have decided collectively that they are going to achieve in that particular Scrum. The courage to speak out, to do the right thing, to work through tough problems, to learn something new. Scrum itself takes a lot of adapting to. Not everybody is familiar or comfortable with working in a true self-led team environment. It can be challenging for folks. Focus on the work of the sprint and the goals of the Scrum team. Openness. We have daily stand-ups. It's not just, yes, we did that yesterday, yes, we did this today, now we have no problems. That's not what you want to hear consistently as a Scrum Master. I mean, in a perfect world maybe, but that just doesn't exist. You want to hear about the challenges on a daily basis because you want to be able to inspect where you are and adapt before you hit the end of that specific sprint. Because at the end of the sprint, if you haven't achieved what you intended to, you set out to, then it's an opportunity to improve as you go through. You need to hear this all the way through. Again, the challenge of working in that team as well, in a true team environment. And respect. I hear organizations all the time talk about we want a culture of high trust. That comes when you enable people to truly self-lead and self-direct their activities. And within the team, each Scrum member needs to respect each other as capable and independent people. And whenever I introduce Scrum to an organization, and whenever I run a kickoff and even into the sprint planning session, I always put these values up again because they are so important to remind people that these are the values that we come to the table with to work together. Okay. Very simply, there are 3 key roles in Scrum. You are either a Scrum Master, a product owner, or the development team. Okay. I'm going to start with the development team first. This team comes together. It's typically a cross-functional representation of the organization. And we're talking IT and development. So from development, definitely operations should be involved in there. So again, there's that DevOps recognition and nod. You'll have testers, you'll have developers, you could have business analysts, many cross-functional team coming together. They are self-organizing and self-directing. So they are the ones that commit to their work. They are the ones that decide how the work will be done. And they are the ones who will succeed together and or fail together. But if you fail, you learn from it and you inspect, you adapt, and you continue on and you improve. Very important, titles are left at the door. Everybody's aware of each other's professional capabilities. However, truly, it is an opportunity for learning, for cross-training, and for understanding that each of us are equal at this table and we're all here to achieve the same goal. So titles are left as at the door. The accountability is with the development team as a whole. So we succeed together. However, at the same time, you cannot assign accountability to a team without giving them the authority and the freedom to take those decisions. And to me, I see this as one of the challenges, especially at a management level. If you're in a very culturally hierarchical managed organization, that this can be very challenging to the management team, especially when they're playing a role, let's say, of a product owner, and we'll talk about that role next, is that the boundaries are set for the development team, the understanding of what they need to achieve, the definition of what done looks like is in place for them to work from, but other than that, it's up to the team to develop and deliver the increment or the outcome. From a product owner perspective then, this is a very unique role. This product owner is accountable for managing the product backlog. We're going to take a look more detail at the product backlog, but they are accountable for ensuring that all of the user stories, so all of the features and or the ultimate increments that we will be delivering to the business, to the client, are organized and prioritized in a database or a spreadsheet as individual product backlog items. This is the list that is introduced to the development team in the sprint planning session to make sure to actually commit to delivering, right? So they will take a product backlog of perhaps, let's say, 50 product backlog items, and they'll say, we will do the first 10 because you've prioritized high and because we can commit to delivering these 10 features or these 10 components of the release in one increment. So they need to ensure that that product backlog is visible, it's transparent, and it is clear to everybody. I think the most time spent is from the product owner perspective, because the development team will go directly to the product owner to say, this is not clear to us. We are challenged with delivering to the definition of done that you have in place. Can you please, can we talk about this? Can we look to adapt in shape or form? So there's a lot of negotiation and representation there from the product owner. The product owner is also representing the business. Okay. So the business isn't at the table with the development team. It's the product owner that is representing the business needs. There's no problem with the development team needing to reach out to the business as needed, but they typically do that through the product owner. And the product owner themselves need to be very respected in the organization, at least their decisions are, okay? The decisions that they make really set those boundaries for that scrum, for that sprint, for that iteration for the development team. And they are a very, very key member of the team. As I said, one of the challenges is when you put a manager in that role who's used to saying, okay, tell me how you're doing this, give me a breakdown of the plan, I want to see every step in a project plan, yada, 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 no, this is how I want it, and how you should do it. That is not the intent of Scrum. Okay? They just set the frameworks. They're there for clarification. They set the prioritization of the work, and then they're available to make sure that items are clear. So a little bit challenging sometimes for managers to step into that role. And then we have the Scrum Master. So Scrum Master, I love, this is a very fascinating role. It's very much a servant leader role. I like to say, and I've got the quotation marks up in the air, the Scrum Master doesn't, quote, do anything. They don't deliver anything. However, they facilitate the Scrum itself. So they help promote and understand Scrum and support Scrum by understanding Scrum theory, practices, the rules, the value, being able to articulate that across the organization. They will coach the Scrum team in self-organization, cross-functionality, and the Scrum approach, because sometimes, especially when a team is first starting to adopt Scrum, it's very difficult to understand self-organizing, and when you've been told what to do and how to do it before, and then all you do is go off and do it, and now you're being told, well, no, it's up to you to decide how to do it. Right? Very, very different perspectives and approaches to working. So the Scrum Master becomes very much a coach. They're a servant leader. That is their role, servant leader. They are not making decisions for the team, but they're helping to guide and facilitate the team with the skills they need to be successful in their Scrum. They're there to remove the barriers, so they protect the development team, sometimes from product owners, sometimes from the business, etc. But they are there to protect and to remove any barriers to the Scrum team's progress. They facilitate the Scrum events as requested and needed, and they ensure that all of the time boxes are respected. So a lot of work in logistics, a lot of upfront work, the Scrum Master working with the product owner for initial planning. So quite a bit of integration there. So how does this all come together? This is just a nice visual of seeing the roles. So here we see the Scrum Master and the development team along with the product owner. And you see here that that product owner is representing the internal and or stakeholders and or customers and users here as well. Okay, so they are kind of that role that reaches out to the internal stakeholders and the customers, represent the business and the business need. So that's it, very simple, 3 main roles in Scrum. Now let's look at the Scrum process itself. So here you see the Scrum roles. We're going to take a look now at more of the details of the process, and then we'll look at the backlog and how you make this real. So we really have some main events that happen. Up front, the Scrum Master will work with the product owner to do the initial planning, to update the product backlog, make sure that it's clear, make sure that definition of done is clear, the user stories are clear, and that backlog has been prioritized by the product owner based on the needs of the business. From there, we go into our main events, which is the sprint planning meeting, our daily cycle, so you hear that called daily stand-up, etc., the daily scrum. Our goal is to release the product increment, and that can be 1 or more increments that make up a release. It depends on how you plan your final release into production. However, this is intended to be a releasable increment. We have the sprint review meeting, which is the 3rd key event. So this is where you do demos and get feedback. And then finally, a retrospective, where this is the opportunity to inspect and adapt for your next sprint cycle. So let's take a look in a bit more detail of what these main activities are. So the sprint itself, it is at the heart of Scrum. It's recommended it is 1 month or less, okay? And that is your time box for creating the increment. It contains the sprint planning, the daily stand-ups, all of the work to create the increment, so the development work, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. So if you start with your planning, you end with your retrospective, then you go into the next sprint. Okay? That is really in the core of what you're determining. Do we do 2-week sprints? Do we do 3-week sprints? Do we do 4-week sprints, etc.? Don't go longer than 4 weeks. Otherwise, you're starting to get more into a more traditional waterfall and or project managed approach as you work through. There are some rules around here, and the rules are important because they do facilitate this agility that we're all trying to achieve, this responsiveness to the business. So sprint planning then, the sprint planning session, a very, very important session. Prior session, the product owner and the Scrum Master have worked together to build out that product backlog. Oftentimes, the development team, as part of their retrospective and even part of the sprint itself, will spend some time grooming, what we say, grooming the product backlog. That is reading through, making sure it's clear, working with the product manager if a user story isn't clear, definition isn't clear. And once that work is done up front, you're ready for your main first sprint event, which is called sprint planning. And sprint planning is where the team is going to figure out 2 things. One is they're going to figure out what to do. So what are they going to do in the sprint. So they're going to take items out of the product backlog and commit to delivering them, and those items become part of the sprint backlog. Okay, so the sprint backlog is just a smaller subset of the product backlog, but the sprint backlog becomes the key focus and that the development team has committed to deliver in this particular sprint. So as part of not only identifying what they are going to work on in the sprint planning meeting, they're also going to identify a few of the high-level tasks of how to do it, how they're going to organize themselves to deliver in this sprint. It's oftentimes, the sprint planning session is oftentimes the first time that your team has come together. They might not work together. They might not have experienced Scrum before. So you may want to look at preceding the sprint planning meeting if you have a brand new team with some education or some type of kickoff for the team, just so that they have an awareness of what they're getting into, what they've signed up for, how things will work prior to coming to the sprint planning session. So just to reiterate, the sprint planning meeting, the first key event in a sprint. It's a meeting in two parts. To define the sprint, your input is the product backlog. If you've got some past performance on the team capacity, you can include that. Business conditions, technology stability, most recent product increments. So that's assuming you've gone through this before. And that's where the team will review, consider, and organize themselves to come up with an agreement on what is the sprint goal and defining that sprint backlog. So what are we going to work on and how are we going to work on it? Okay. This is typically time boxed. We've got another slide that will show all the time boxes, but this is time boxed as 8 hours. This is 8 hours spent together as a team, and highly, highly recommended that it's face-to-face. Okay. We'll talk about the challenges with remote sprinting at the end of this as well. So your team has committed to what they're going to deliver. They've got their sprint backlog. They've broken those user stories down into more tasks, more detailed tasks. They know who's working on what, who's working together, how they're approaching it as a team. And then every day, they have what's called a daily stand-up. Now, this used to be where literally the name daily stand-up came from development world, where people were so busy sitting down coding that they needed to stand for 15 minutes. So that's where the daily stand-up came from. But it is a very, very simple call. It is, or discussion. It's what did you do yesterday? Basically, because this happens daily. So what did you do yesterday? What are you planning to do today? And is there anything in your way of achieving your goals for today? Now, as a Scrum Master, I could ask these questions, and I have asked these questions, but if you're lucky enough to have all of your Scrum team in one room, sometimes they just organically, somebody stands up and say, let's do our stand-up, and they will run it themselves, and that's fine too. People love this aspect. It keeps them focused for the day, and it is the opportunity for the Scrum Master to say, to do their work, which is removing any obstacles. And it's an opportunity, as it shows, to inspect and adapt. Then we have the sprint review meeting. So this is very informal. This is where we are demoing our increment and our product. So this is where we have taken the work, we have done the work as we've expected. We believe we are at done, as according to the definition of done. The clients could be involved in this. So this is where you can also involve the external stakeholders, the internal stakeholders. The Scrum team is part of this. The product owner is part of this. Sometimes it's just the product owner you're presenting to. But this is where we are looking for feedback. We're fostering that ongoing collaboration, because every sprint, once we've gone through a cycle, we're going to go into another cycle of a sprint. That is the intent here. So it's very informal. This is not a PowerPoint presentation. This is typically a demo, a real demo of what you've built and what you're going to release. 4 hours maximum is what's recommended here. And the final sprint event is the sprint retrospective meeting. And so this is the very last activity in the sprint. So we are going to reflect on what we did, and we're going to talk about improvements for the future. And those improvements can actually go into the product backlog as improvement opportunities. So it might not be feature driven development. It's more an improvement of the Scrum process and how you're going to go about self-organizing as a team going forward. Great feedback. You hear a lot in these retrospectives. It's all recorded online and people can access it at any time. And here is also an opportunity to give some thought into reviewing how well definition of done was defined. Was it poorly defined so it impeded our ability to deliver, or was it well defined? And let's take a peek at what's next. Let's just get our headspace ready, because as soon as we finish this retrospective meeting, the next day, we're going to go back into our next planning session, and it continues again. So very, very interesting, very simple. Four key events. Our planning session, okay, our daily stand-up, our sprint review, and our retrospective. And the sprint itself is recommended 1 month only. So here you see these time boxes. And this would be your maximum hours that are shown here, but you can go shorter. And I've actually worked in sessions where we did 2-week sprints, not 1 month sprints, and we combined the review and retrospective together. So all of this is valid. What's really, really important is that when you adopt Scrum, that you follow each of these events, that you hold each of these events, because each of them builds on your ability to deliver an agile perspective. So that's our key events there. I'm going to look at 3 of the main artifacts. So the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the burn down chart. So product backlog, very simply, it is a collection of requirements from the business, and they are written in terms of what are called user stories. So, for example, as a teller, I want to be able to find clients by last name so that I can find their profile faster. Okay, so we'll take a closer look at the technique of stories as we close. But these stories, user stories, are in place that define the role, what I want to be able to do, and why. So as a system admin, that's your role. I want to be able to configure user settings, what you want to do, so that I can control access. So what do you want to achieve there? And we'll also talk about story points. So story points are what help us to understand velocity of the team. So how many story points can a team achieve and historically, and what can we commit to? Again, I will talk a little bit more about estimating those story points, because there's no hard science to this. It's about estimating. And we've got some techniques for estimating those story points. But really simply, the product backlog is a prioritized list of user stories. And remember, the role that does the prioritization and owns and is accountable for this product backlog is the product owner. Okay. This product backlog is then input to the sprint planning session, and in the sprint planning session, they pick items from the product backlog, and these become items in now what's called the sprint backlog, because these are the items we're going to address in the sprint backlog. And that's where they take the stories from the product backlog item and break them down into more detailed tasks. And each of those tasks really shouldn't last longer than 2 days. If they are, then you need to break it down even more. There's a lot of breakdown happening here, so that you can get people assigned to deliver effectively in that time frame of the sprint. The task board itself should be visible, whether that's through an online tool like a Trello, or any visible Kanban tool. So Kanban means to do, doing, done. Just think of it as a big board with a bunch of sticky notes on it. It can also be like a very visible board in the Scrum room if you have the luxury of having a Scrum team all together in a room, which is, of course, the ultimate, most highly recommended approach for running a Scrum. But reality dictates sometimes we have people remote. So you have to use more online collaboration tools. So the product backlog becomes the sprint backlog, which is the committed items. It's an ordered list of requirements. The team, the development team, sets that order. They break down how they're going to approach delivering to their committed backlog items in the sprint. And considerations or risks, any dependencies. You don't want links in dependencies, what kind of deadlines you're working to, what are your timeframes in the sprint, and always, always, always make it focused on delivering business value. I apologize, I did see a quick question come up there, but I missed it. If you could just chat that again, I could address it while we're here. I think it had to do with business requirements. So I'll continue until I see that again. Oh, here we go. Thank you. I just saw this question. I just want to address it while it's here. When do we expect the business team to validate that change? Do they do it in the next sprint? So should the real delivery take 2 sprints to go live? Okay, at any time during the sprint, the development team can reach out to the business. You do not have to wait for the review meeting. It is formally, the event formally in Scrum is the review meeting, where you would demo and present your development to the business customer. But you do not have to wait for that review meeting. You can reach a product owner at any time. You can ask them to engage the business at any time with you. It's just not that formulistic, okay? It's all that Scrum notes is that you do have a review session, but you don't have to wait until then. Because sometimes you don't want to. You want feedback sooner. So very good question. Thank you. I hope I answered that. Okay. IT security, well, they oftentimes they should be part of the team. If there are high security requirements, then that needs to be understood in what's being developed. So you're kind of getting into DevSecOps then, which is the development security operations coming together. And really that underpins that DevOps and DevSecOps is based on this concept of Agile as well, and Agile development. So it should be considered right up front as requirements. The final artifact we'll take a look at here is what's called a burn down chart. So again, along this line of being able to inspect and adapt and having transparency, a very simplistic view is what's called a burn down chart. And it's the tool that we use. Here on the very top right, you see ideal world. You see the effort hours. So you could do that in effort hours. You could represent this in story points. There's a lot of great samples out in Google land for different types of burn down charts. But in its simplest form, the team can estimate the number of hours that they're going to spend as a collective team in the sprint. And each day they can record the hours spent. And so you kind of see ideal line, that's the red line in all of these charts. And then in the top right-hand corner, you're seeing, oh, everything's going great, okay? However, that's not real world. So we've got other examples. The one on the bottom, Somebody said that reminds me of my college days, because they're going along, not getting it done, and then all of a sudden, boom, at the very end, you're racing towards finish. And the idea of Scrum as well is not to kill yourself on these things, is that if you've got issues, if you've got timing issues, etc., to talk about them right in the daily stand-up, so that you don't end up in this situation where you don't end up panicking to deliver, because it's intended to be sustainable. You're not there for just one sprint. You need to be part of that team to really understand the benefits and to achieve the benefits of Scrum for at least 2, 3, 4, 5 different Scrums that are planned. So don't burn yourself out. That's what this one shows. And the one up here on the top left, what this is showing us, some of you may have included this, is a couple of things. So one, just look at it explicitly. The team did not make their delivery goal. They didn't make what they committed to in that Scrum. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes they have gone back and renegotiated definition of done with the product owner, maybe broken a user story out, but it shouldn't be the intent or the fallback to not achieve what you committed to deliver. But it does happen, and it goes back into the product backlog. However, what is reality in real life, especially when you're starting, is a lot of times people forget to update their burn down chart on a daily basis. So they might have actually delivered it, but they just forgot to update their burn down chart. Seen that too. So as they mature through a couple of sprint cycles, they start to understand the value of that burn down chart. Once you've got this experiential data, then you can bring that into your next planning session when they're estimating their hours and committing to what they're going to be able to deliver. You can start to use some of this data moving forward. So that's 3 key artifacts: the product backlog, the user stories, etc. So who should update the hours of a burn down chart? The development team. This is their tool. Okay, this is their tool. Good comment. So just a couple of techniques here, and then we'll close with making this more real, as I've discussed too. So one of the items that we spend a lot of time on, I have spent a lot of time as a Scrum Master working with my product owner and with the development team feedback, is to get very, very clear definitions of done. This really sets the expectation. This really sets the expectation for how what we are going to deliver. What does done look like? What is successful? And it is in definition of done. Definition of done can be simple, or it can be actual full acceptance criteria. Okay, so somebody had asked about that. That comes into play where you're starting to do some test-driven development, perhaps, or leveraging some of their agile techniques in here. The idea is that we need to know what done looks like so that we can commit to delivering within this the sprint backlog, the items that are within this iteration. Okay. As you become more mature, you get more stringent criteria, and definitely this is a real case of getting feedback in your retrospectives. The development team will tell the product manager that their definition of done really needs to get tightened up next time. Okay. And very different levels there. There's a lot of good detail underneath all of this, obviously, and I wanted to, in the short time we have together, at least give some ideas of how this works. So along the techniques as well, we talk very simply from this sprint level and the daily, so your sprint planning and your daily planning, or your daily stand-up. But when you look at a fuller picture, you're also going to be doing work before going into your sprints from a release planning perspective. So trying to figure out logistically how many sprints you're going to need to package into a release. to actually go live. This is work done between the Scrum Master and the product owner. Obviously, releases can link into products, and then you get up higher in the onion, you get at a portfolio planning, and then overall strategic planning. So the sprint doesn't exist just on its own. It is definitely within the context, at least, of a release. Okay, so that's important to understand there as well. Then we call that the planning onion. Here's an example of a release defined at many different levels, at a system or a program level. Here you can see that one release, here's release 5, is actually going to be broken down into 4 sprints. That was the decision by this team. There's a rule of thumb, kind of average, you want a release every 3 months. But again, this is not carved in stone. This is all up to the organization as to what makes most demand of the business, etc. And especially if you're practicing DevOps, like you could set the iteration and you could have a week iteration of a sprint. You could, if that was your intent. Okay. Just a little bit more on stories. So wanted to share that everything in our product backlog and sprint backlog, what we work on, even stuck as index cards up on a visual Kanban board in the Scrum room, is the user story. So, and it's always in the same structure. As a user type, I want to do some action so that I achieve a desired response. Really, really practical to be able to continue to deliver that value and keep it customer focused. And you see each user story then can be broken down by the tasks to deliver that story. This is the work of the development team. And this, they've just kind of recorded the team hours that they're going to spend on each of these tasks. And this just continues throughout the sprint. And it all hangs together. So you see here a major release can be made up of 4 sprints. This one sprint is made up of 5 user stories. That's what was pulled into the sprint backlog. And each story then can be broken into tasks. So that's how you practically start working it down. It's actually very intuitive for the development team as they go into this. Very intuitive. And another technique we used here is velocity. So if we have historical data, if we assign story points, we can then calculate team velocity. So we completed 136 story points in the past 12 sprints. Divide 136 by 12 and you've got 11. So we can deal with 11 story points. That is our current team velocity. So how the heck do we get story points? Well, you can do it through different estimating techniques. Blind estimation is where you're going in that new, you're decomposing stories. Very, very complex, not highly recommended, but it is a technique. Affinity estimating, where you take 5 minutes, everybody has their user stories on sticky notes, and they just intuitively stick them into small, medium, large t-shirt kind of sizing. So it helps very quickly to estimate some different categories. And then from there, you can actually go into one of the most popular, which is called planning poker. So this is estimating relative to each other. So I'm going to say that this very simple task has 2 story points, and everybody agrees on that at the team. Then what's next is, okay, this one's a little bit more complex, so we're going to go with a 3 or a 5 or an 8. It's based on the Fibonacci sequence. If you add 3 plus 5, it equals 8. 5 plus 8 is 13, etc. And then you can get ones that are so big that people say, whoa, wait a minute, we've got to break that story back down into smaller. But it's always an approximation. There's no real science to it, but it is lessons learned over time. You get better and better able to produce those velocity numbers over time. You can't do that when you first start. You need time. And then you can report overall on the success. So the sprint success rates, defects, your burn down rates, velocity, your output, overall satisfaction, and usually very low team member turnover here. And the reason for that is people are satisfied. They're self-directed. Large complex projects, so a lot of complexity can be involved here. This is where you get more into safe, scaled enterprise, longer durations and lengths of sprints. You can have what's called Scrum of Scrum teams. So just recognize that this can be scaled. Okay. And just finally, to close, where did I start? We'll figure out what you're trying to achieve, what best practices you have in place, what you can leverage today, and what your desired outcomes are. Okay? There's a lot of different best practices out there. All are complementary, which is important to recognize. And you can also look at it from a life cycle approach. This is looking at from the develop, build, package, test stage, and production, the DevOps cycle. Here you've got your Scrum development linked in with continuous integration, continuous testing. You've got your continuous delivery and deployment. If that meets your needs, you can actually have Agile service management. Here's your ITIL flow, so managing the life cycle, and as always, continual service improvement and lean and everything we do based on collaboration, and can also work within the framework. It all starts to come together. Scrum, I'm hoping that you're taking away very practical, open communications. It enables, encourages cross-functional teams. There's pride in what people do. It's a learning opportunity for the org, and you can leverage these learning to other areas like Agile CSI. On the other side, we've got some challenges. Yeah, I think probably through this you guys are saying, well, wait a minute, I've got remote team members. Well, you're going to have to really work hard, bring the team together for the initial planning session. They need to meet at least once, meet as often as you can. However, you can facilitate this remote using collaboration tools like Trello, etc. And what integrates everything in this case tends to be more that daily stand-up call. You need to have understand your team capacity, and they get better over time. You need to deal with resistance to change. Well, I'll talk about that just in our final slide. Next, people need to be comfortable that we're working with estimates. We're working with our best capabilities to deliver to our committed deliverables versus timelines. We're not going to burn ourselves out on this. This is something, an approach that we're going to continue and sustain in the organization. You have to get away from no project manager. There's no traditional project manager role here. I think you're seeing this. We know our time boxes. We can commit to those time boxes. Off we go. Our team is going to deliver. I talk a bit about the manager and the product owner role. Sometimes it's hard for them to let go and let the team self-direct. Find that quite often. And too many team members. You want to keep your development team to 6 plus or minus 3 people. Most effective is 6. 9, do not go above 9 people. It's too much. It's too big. It does not work. Okay. And finally, a great technique you can use when you're dealing with management of change is John Cotter. And this is where he talks about creating a sense of urgency, building a guiding coalition, form strategic vision and initiatives, enlist a volunteer army. Okay, the Scrum team should be volunteer to a large degree, especially when you're starting. Enable action by removing barriers. Generate your short-term wins and sustain that acceleration and institute the change, and then you start all over again. It's a continual cycle. This is very agile in itself, and in fact he has recognized that our whole organization structure is evolving towards a fundamentally new way of business, and you're going to have dual organizations, that traditional hierarchical structure, but now this agile networked team approach, and we're seeing that more and more and more. And wherever possible, build those collaboration rooms, get your teams together, and I have seen nothing but positive outcomes from my experience with organizations adopting Scrum. And with that, I apologize, we're 2 minutes over here. I'm just going to open up for any final questions or comments. I'll hand it back to Paul.
Thanks, Abby. Fantastic program. There's a lot of information here, folks, obviously. And obviously you can't cover this all in an hour, but Abby's done a phenomenal job. I think there's one more here. So if we have a case where we have a mural testing, how do we SP efforts for both QA and dev?
If you need to do, I'm sorry, that was remedial testing?
So if we have a case where we have manual testing, how do we... Okay.
Okay, manual testing, yeah, thanks. Obviously, you want to automate testing where possible. That's really taking in that more DevOps philosophy to increase velocity. But if you need to do some manual testing, it is built into the cycle. You build it in as a task. Okay, so as you're going through and you're building out the increment, you identify exactly what has to be done. Testers are on your team. Okay, there's typically testers. However, if there's backlog for a tester, then everybody jumps in and helps wherever they can. It's no one person role accountability. It's the team together helping out. And that will come out in your daily Scrum if there's any issues or backlog there.
We are Starweaver. Education you can bank on. For more information, contact us.